I first started doing clubs, I think, in 1998. I did my first one, and at the time I was in the Norwich Club, which is my local club, and I was so nervous that after 10 minutes I ran out of anything to say. And a very, very good friend of mine, bless him, who died late last year, he sat right on the front row and he kept me going for an hour and a half asking me questions, because after 10 minutes I'd run dry. Doesn't happen anymore. But, and that was quite poor. You know, that demo was quite poor, it wasn't very good, but, you know, gradually over the years, the more I did, the better I got. And I did lots and lots and lots of carving demonstrations. For some reason, for years, all anybody wanted to see was wood carving. So I've been up and down the length of the country and around Europe and to America and all sorts of places doing a basic carving, wood carving demo, which I'm sure I've done it here at some time and made a mess. And, you know, people say, well, that's amazing, I don't know how you just produced that, you know, that stump or whatever, but, you know, the first 25 or 30 I did weren't very good. And certainly most of the trees I styled in the early days, I had a big box of photos tucked away in a cupboard the other day, about yay big, and, you know, paper photos like we used to have. You were old enough to remember those. And most of those trees were dead. You know, I was taking all sorts of stuff that wasn't ready and twisting it all up and wiring it all up and doing all sorts of dastardly things, and most of them died. And, but you know what they say, practice makes perfect, so the more you do, the better you get. But so many people I find are so afraid that they might do something wrong that they don't do anything. And like they say, if you try you might fail, if you don't try you're guaranteed to fail. So don't go and buy a £1,000 tree and use that as your first styling exercise, or buy a really expensive tree and use that as your first carving project. You know, that's where the stuff comes from skips and all that sort of thing, because it's really useful and it doesn't really cost you anything. And you cut your teeth on that sort of stuff. I mean, the reason I started wood carving, my dad used to let me use power tools when I was 9 years old. Before I was 10, I could put a shelf up, you know, with plugs in the wall and all that sort of stuff. So my dad never had any issues with letting me play with power tools, and so of course when I came to bonsai, it was just a logical progression, and everything I had was garbage, and everything I had was big sawn off stumps, so there was really no choice. And but you know, like they say, if you've got lemons, you make lemonade. So there's no point in, you know, so many people pine for better quality material, excuse the pun, but you work with what you've got. And strangely, this material gets better and better, and it finds you after a while. You know, you don't have to, you don't have to knock yourself out trying to find good quality material. When like they say, when the pupil's ready, the teacher appears. And I think that when you're ready, the material appears as well. I mean, I've certainly had people come to the garden with more money than sense and want to buy in £2,000–3,000 trees for their first bonsai. And you know, we don't tend to entertain those sort of folk, because I know what happens, and we see it happen, and you know, they lose those trees and then they're lost to bonsai. We prefer to walk you through it and teach it progressively. Otherwise, you're just going to get yourself in trouble, and it just happens so often. So you just work with what you've got, and if you're not too sure what to do, if it's a good quality piece of material, don't do anything. Years and years ago, I collected a really impressive yew tree in the local woods, and if I show you a picture of it, you will know it. It's sort of a tree that's sort of got quite well known, and I didn't even know if you could collect a tree that big. It was very, very big with, you know, big gnarly base. I was with Catherine at the time, and she said, well, what's the worst that could happen? You know? I mean, all I had was a little tiny spade, which was useless. I mean, I wouldn't even try and get out of the ground with those tools these days. But But you know, all that woodroom was getting cleared, so it was like, well, you take it, or you know, if you take it, it dies. If you leave it, it's going to be dead anyway. So what makes a difference? So we took it, and you know, it survived and it grew. I remember my dad came and looked at it, and my dad's not into bonsai at all. But we could do that. It wasn't massive. I said, you know, when it's ready, I'm sure there'll be somebody who will know. And there was. You know? And I looked into Kevin's garden, and he knew exactly what to do with it. And you know, that experience changed my life forever. And I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that experience, because that experience taught me the things that I'd been missing. I'd spent years on my own learning horticulture and growing things. You know, I could grow a broom handle, but I couldn't style worth a damn. I certainly couldn't do any carving and stuff. And so it was kind of that experience that set me on the road. And so, you know, bonsai, like I've already said, is a progressive thing, but the way that we develop trees is progressive, in that we're building branch structure and so on and so forth, but the way that we learn is progressive as well. I've often thought that if you're still impressed with the trees you had 10 years ago, you either bought really, really good trees at the outset, or you haven't learned much along the way. And my dad, I think the most valuable thing my dad ever gave me was a little bit of wisdom, and he said, you only get out of life what you put in. He said, it's like a bank account. You don't put anything in, you can't take anything out. And one of the things I've found with life and with bonsai is that the more you put in, the more you get out. And you know, I've done some ridiculous things. I mean, we got to a stage where, you know, I was putting so much into this we couldn't afford to eat. And you know, I quit work. It's a long story. I ended up in hospital with pneumonia because of the stress of it all. I quit work and never went back. And I didn't have a bean to my name. And as it happens, 2 or 3 weeks after I quit work, we had to go way down south of the country somewhere to do a demo there. And I mean, I was, you know, we had nothing, absolutely nothing, no income. I'd never not had a job in my entire life. It was a terrifying time of my life. And we stopped by a garden centre. You know what I did? Bought a whole bunch of junipers. It was about the last 100 quid I had in my pocket. We bought all these little junipers. And you know, sometimes if you want to do something in life, it may cost you a little, and you may need to commit to it. And bonsai is much like that. The more you put into it, the more you get out. I appreciate, I mean, I didn't choose it as a business or a lifestyle. It kind of chose me, because you pour your heart and soul into something long enough, that's going to happen. But success is a nice thing to experience. And also, I think using the trees as, I don't really like the term, but using the trees as an artistic medium. You know, I have issues with bonsai and so on and so forth, but that's each to the individual's own ideas. But it's really nice to be able to visualise something and have the wherewithal to create it, but it doesn't, I don't think that it's necessarily something that only certain people can do. I think, as I was saying the other week at the demo I was doing down south that 1 or 2 of you were at, there are a few really, really skilled bonsai artists out there that can kind of sprinkle a little magic over the top of their trees. But I think that 98% of us can get 95% of the way if we try. And when you do something, say you're styling a tree, you're working with a tree, you get so far and you're quite happy with it, but then you keep working and then you get better, and then you get better. I build motorcycles when I'm not mucking about with trees, and I got back to that just 4 or 5 years ago, and the first few I did were, well, the first couple I did weren't very good, but now they came really good. And you know, because you learn little tricks. You learn suppliers, you learn people that you can get things from, you learn all sorts of ideas and tricks and things that you didn't necessarily know before. And I think bonsai is much the same way. So, styling trees can be quite formulaic. It's quite easy to make a tree a bit like an airfix kit. You know, you join number 1 to number 1 and number 2 to number 2, and you end up with your aeroplane or your tank or whatever it is you're making. And bonsai can be a little bit like painting by numbers or putting an airfix kit together, that you can just take one piece and add to another piece and add to another piece, and you can make very, very impressive trees doing that. And it doesn't take a lot of, doesn't necessarily take a lot of skill or inspiration. And especially when you're not working on really good quality, sort of top quality material, it's quite easy to work in that formulaic fashion. And certainly if you turn up at a workshop and you've got 12 people there over 6 hours, you've got to rely on that, because you can't sit around waiting for inspiration on everybody's trees, because they'll all have gone home before you get your act together. Wouldn't recommend doing that sort of thing. But, I mean, one simple thing in terms of how that we arrange a branch structure. We all know that foliage branches reach out towards the light, and on the lower part of the tree typically branches will come down because they're longer and so older, and then the weight will gradually draw those down. And as you go up the tree, the branches come from this kind of angle and then progressively do this. Okay? So with deciduous trees that works really well. Typically with a branch that comes down, a lower branch, say like these I'll put in place here, what we want to do is create this, because what we want, everything reaches out towards the light and it'll spread in every different direction. So if we get this and then this on the end with the little forks on the end, we start to build that quite nicely. A branch line that does this never looks as good as a branch line that does this, because a branch that comes down and out makes a tree look much more stable. And particularly with a fairly long trunk, gangly sort of a tree like this, we want to make this look stable. There's always a tendency for this type of tree to look a little unstable or a little top heavy. Now, typically at this stage of first work, the tree does look top heavy, but as time goes by, I've noticed everybody assumes that bonsai get bigger as they get older and more mature, but they don't. They tend to become smaller and tighter and more compact, but more powerful at the same time. Which is why you should never just style a tree and then put it into a pot, because given 4 or 5 years, that pot will just be completely wrong. As I said before, we're looking at building branch structure, and I'm guessing you all understand the basics of pruning from 1 into 2 and 2 into 4 and 4 into 8 and so on and so forth. If you don't understand that, give me a shout and I'll explain it. But we're looking for ramification that progressively forks from the thick branch, getting thinner and thinner and thinner as we go out. And there's no reason on a tree like this why we can't use what we've got, and at the same time, over the next few years, be progressively pruning this in such a way that we're improving the ramification. So at the moment, some of these branches are a bit long, and we'll pull them all up a little bit and tighten it all up and compact it. But what we can then progressively do is pruning back and improving the structure of that. So to me, it's perfectly okay to build a deciduous tree like this, because we're, it's a progressive process. Now, I'm going to pick this side as the front of this tree. One of the things always important is to have the top of a tree coming towards you. When you were a little kid, you stood in front of a tree and you looked at it like this, and if the clouds were going by, you'd fall over backwards on the grass because it didn't look like it. And so, to create that impression of height, it's important that the top kind of comes towards you. Now, on the top of this, we've got this branch, comes up the trunk, round and back. And sort of more or less resolves itself there. The centre of it is directly above the trunk, so it balances quite nicely. So there's no reason to start trying to pull this about. One of the significant skills, I think, in terms of styling trees, there are elements that we can change and elements we can't. And I think there's a great deal of skill and wisdom involved in knowing the difference. For years I spent time with trunks this size trying to bend them and twist them and pull them all sorts of ways, and big tourniquets and big ropes and chains and goodness knows what and things, and every time it ended up badly, and I didn't, I gradually sort of stopped doing that. Yeah, this is fundamentally a straight tree, but it's got a little character to it. It's got some nice bark and some cherries, so all we're going to do is arrange this tree that it shows off its best character. If it's not good enough for you, go buy a better one, or go find a better one. Don't try to make a tree into something that it's not, because it'll never end well for you or the tree. The tree will come off worse for sure. When you see me with pliers on, what I'm doing is holding the wire and then bending the branch, because it gives me much more control, nice and close, to get nice tight bends rather than just using these little fat fingers. So I'm not grabbing the branch, I'm actually holding the wire. But also, if you don't want to bend this piece, you hold it there and then you bend this piece. As opposed to if you just pull this piece, it tends to bend all the way along. And what we're looking for is interesting branch lines. These trees are, in most winters, deciduous, so we're looking for some sort of nice branch line. So we're not just looking for a branch line that does that, we're looking for a branch line that kind of moves a little bit. Any old gnarly tree, look underneath it, it tends to have those sort of slightly sort of wavy branches going off in different directions. And also when you're bending it, if it's a relatively long branch, some of these are coming from the inside and we want to get them out here. So rather than just bending a S shape, what we want to do is go up, down, round, back, bending in all different directions. And also any side shoots we can use off that can be potentially used later on for shortening the branches back. So this is the first time we've had anything done with it at all, apart from being collected and ruby, of course. And invariably what I like to do is keep everything. I wired this tree at the weekend, and as I know I wasn't going to get it all done tonight, and nothing got cut off at all. Everything that I had on Saturday morning is still here. Some of it cut off, obviously. But the more you cut off a tree, the more you have to grow back. And in this country, growth is hard won, especially in the summer like we're having this year. And the more growth you cut off, the more you're going to have to grow back, and it's all just making everything so much sort of longer and contracted overall.
Is Graham, the apex, the trees that apex dominant, so you're getting more growth on the top, yeah? So yeah. You're not going to cut it, but you're going to bend it and bring it in, yeah? At the top. If you're trying to push the bottom layers,
yes, yep.
And you don't actually cut back the growth on the top, apex, does that not? I thought cutting, you generally try to cut back on the top to force the growth out and down the bottom. Like this.
In general, yes. I mean, with this particular tree, more or less everything comes off the top quarter of the tree, and these are not overly apically dominant. Whereas if you do have a tree that's very apically dominant, it's growing more strongly in the top, then as Mark says, you want to prune more. So particularly things like larch, very strong on the top of the tree. So you can prune, potentially if you were to wire the shape, you put the skeleton in place, and you would do that with it leaf, but you would potentially cut that back quite hard in the top half, maybe even by 70%. But then the lower branches, you would more or less leave those 100%. So that when the growth, when the leaves emerge, you've got fairly balanced growth all the way through. And as the tree matures and develops and ages as bonsai, that whole idea of sort of balancing the vigour becomes significantly more important. If you go to a top exhibition, you can always separate the men from the boys, because the boys have always got amazing looking trees with very weak lower branches, or smaller needles, or smaller leaves, or more more sparse ramification on the lower parts than on the top. That's a very, very skilled job to keep a tree nicely balanced all the way through. But that really is something that's quite species specific. So with trees that are very apically dominant, then at the first styling you might prune more, whereas if they're less apically dominant, then you would keep more. The more you cut off, as I said, the more you have to grow back. And I mean, we'll come on to this if I get time. When we start talking about particularly the pines after, that getting that growth and balancing that growth is really more important. But the trouble is with deciduous trees, as you know, I mean, we can saw this off through here and it'll spray up and regrow and we can kind of start again. Evergreens are slightly different in as much as they won't necessarily grow very well from old wood, if at all. And typically they'll grow very, very slowly as well. So deciduous trees you can perhaps be less concerned at this stage about the balance of the vigor between the top and the lower parts of the tree. Does that make any sense? That's a technique that tends to be more significant as the trees age and have been in bonsai pots longer, but it's certainly a consideration. Ultimately, the only place a tree gets any energy from is sunlight. The only way it takes that energy is leaves, and the more leaves we cut off and the more green we cut off and the more branches we get rid of, the more we reduce a tree, the harder it is for that tree to recover. Everybody thinks that the trees grow from the roots, but they don't. It's the top that feeds the roots. And without this doesn't work, but then without this doesn't work. So they're totally interdependent upon each other. But if we want to build a good root system, we've got to have foliage to do it and to achieve that. And so the more foliage we cut off, the harder it is for a tree to recover. As I said, I think with broadleaf trees particularly, they do everything so much faster, they'll recover much, much more quickly. Particularly things like junipers can take a long time to sort themselves out, especially if you cut too much foliage off, and Scots pine's the same. So we'll come on to that a little later. Because this has been just allowed to grow, we've got some fairly long branches here. You can see like this one here, this is longer than that. And so I've got quite a bit of length on there with a lot of twigging on the end. That's not particularly ideal for what we want to do. But there's no reason to just cut it back to start to regrow it. We can use a large proportion of this. Oaks thankfully are really flexible as well. Not many people I think use deciduous trees for demos, but oaks particularly are very, very flexible. The fallback for most demos is sort of pines and junipers really, but for me these oaks work really well because they are nice and flexible. Also, they'll work well over the summer. We don't tend to work these when they're not in heat. We tend to not like it. Whereas in the past I've done these within a week, they start throwing in shoes.
Is it going for English oaks as well?
Sorry?
Is it going for English oaks as well?
I've never really done much with English oaks, to be honest. They tend to be one of those trees that I've not ever done very well with.
No,
if you wire them, they just tend to spring back. They just don't ever seem to hold. Whereas these, one wire and that shape stays. But yeah, I mean, with it, I would say across the board with any oak, it should be worked in any way, shape or form when it's in leaf, when they're dormant. It doesn't seem to take so well in my experience. Now with this tree, what we've got here is obviously quite a strong movement off this way. So now we're looking for something to start to resolve that, because if we arrange all this over here, it's going to look a bit top heavy, and then we're going to have to use a massive pot to balance it all up visually. One of the reasons I wanted to get this done now is because these branches, there's nothing in here thicker than probably 8-9 mm. That's a good thickness to be able to bend these branches. And based on past experience, this wire will probably start to come off in about 6 weeks' time, at which point most of the structure will stay in position. We've done more than a few of these this time of year, and typically 6 to 8 weeks at this time of year is all it takes to fix the growth in position. And at the moment the branches are a little thin and they're a little weedy, and but over the next 3-4 years this will allow to be grown and prune back, and they'll thicken up, and as they thicken up, those what look like kind of weird lines at the moment start to look much more powerful, much more significant in the overall design of the tree. As I already said, bonsai is a progressive thing, and it takes time, it takes a little vision, perhaps it takes a little imagination. I think with experience, I look back at some trees that I started 20-25 years ago. I look back at them and I can't really remember what they were like, and you look at pictures and you think, did that happen? You know? And my daughter's 23 years old now, she doesn't look like age, she was born a month premature, she was about 8, and so you think, how did that grow into that? You know, it's amazing. You know, bonsai trees are the same. Any of you have kept pictures of your trees over the years, you'll know exactly what I'm saying. That things progress enormously, don't they? But every year, you don't see any significant change. It's only when you look back over a period of time that you really see that significant change. It's always worth keeping pictures. But
how do you notice as you get older trying linear anyway? I'm sure it's exponential.
Yeah.
Too long scale for you.
What you're saying is as difficult to keep up. Yeah, I get up in the morning and there's no turning like me up, it's time to go to bed again. Never seem to get anything done. My dad used to give me a lot of stick when I was younger because you stay up all night and then, get up late, go to bed late, get up late. But I get up when it gets light and go to bed when it gets dark, and turn into my dad. Which I guess we do, don't we?
It's even worse when you come down the stairs and see a picture your own reflection walking down the stairs and you see your dad.
Yep.
Perhaps it's a good job to see your dad. It could be real. Or your mum in your case.
I come downstairs, some say, here's my dad. Bless him, he's still, is he 75, 76? He still comes twice a week, doing 2 half days, packing parcels, all sorts of stuff for us. Bless him. I've got a choice of 2 tops here. We'll try and break this one off. Generally, when a tree is left to its own devices, it'll everything, as Mark said, everything wants to go up, and so left to its own devices, you will end up with an awful lot of goings on at the top, which you may need to sort out. And what I thought was going to be an apex is now not going to be an apex, because to me, 1 trunk, 1 top. If we get a big branch coming off here, we potentially make 2 tops. But typically, one trunk, 1 base, 1 apex. And it's very often something I've seen a lot in a lot of trees where you've got sort of 2, 3, 4 potential tops, which nobody quite knew which one to chop out. So they just kind of left it in which one to leave. So you spend a lot with sort of big gnarly Chinese elms that they look amazing. When you look underneath, there's 4, 5, 6 sort of leaf tops on them. But we don't really want to have that situation here.